just a quick overview of the main points made in Chapter 4. Again, some of them have already been discussed in the previous sessions, and then I will focus on the specific point of fake news and white ignorance, which will be what will drag most of our critical discussion, which will be the third point, but that will be led by Anderau here. So again, I present here the index that is provided by Karen in her book, dealing with some of the contents. What is fake news? Causes of the fake news problems. Here we have 3 different set of causes, like cognitive or psychological, technological, and social causes. The epistemic damage of fake news. Here we will see how the veritistic account is applied and some how they can also trust. Fake news and white ignorance, and fake news objectivity and neutrality, which is, I think, the point in which we have less to comment on. So first, in order to present the 2 critiques to advance some of the 2 critiques that will be explained by Glenn later, we'll have to have in mind the definitions of fake news that are presented here. And the first one, which seems like to be probably the main one, is the deliberate presentation of typically false or misleading claim as news, where the claims are misleading by design. And just to pick up other definition brought up in the chapter is fake news as the exploitation of the technological affordances and incentive structures of social media platforms, online search engines, and the broader news media industry to spread fabricated information for financial or political gain. Here, it just seems interesting that the focus is put more on the technological features that enable fake news than the truth content itself. And just to compare what makes these definitions interesting is to compare with the case of the fake news as a floating signifier, saying that fake news is just a signifier used by different political positions to construct political identities and conflicts and antagonisms. While the author accepts this approach as a tool for analyzing somehow fake news push some political agendas, she's, no matter that, sympathetic to the vision that we do have to stick to truth when we analyze fake news. And I just present this because it will be important for some of the concerns that Glenn will raise. Also, is the definition of the problem we are discussing. So here we have a first application of how veritism is applied in this context, saying clearly that first of all, disseminating false news stories, like it provides some normative account of what is the problem with fake news, which is harder to get with other more descriptive views of the problems. So here we can clearly say fake news is problematic from the point of view of epistemology, because since truth is our main epistemic good, then the more false stories we have, the more chances we have to, or not exactly chances, but the easier it is to come across false beliefs. So I just use this as a way of putting this visually. And she also underlines 2 practical gains from the veritistic account. First, it's easier to identify the solution we have to provide to acquire a better epistemical environment. If we are clear on our problem, that we have too much false stories that lead to much more false beliefs, then we just have to provide an environment that allows us to avoid this dissemination of false beliefs, which is not such obvious when we leave truth at the side. Moreover, we can hold fakers accountable for the epistemic damage they're producing. If we don't think that truth is the main good thing here, maybe we are not as clear on which is exactly what they are blamed for. And this is the first two epistemic harms that she identifies related to truth itself. And another problem is that they disseminate so much distrust in what would other be trustful actors or institutions that now it's not that we have more false beliefs or not, it's that at some point we don't care about what is true or what is not. So this is the point that we wanted to focus on now, which is the account that is provided about white privilege. It's defined as a non-knowing, or a specific, first of all, as a specific form of racial ignorance, but it's specifically as a non-knowing that has its causal origins in white racism or white racial domination. It produces false beliefs and a sense of true belief. So it can make us think that something that happened didn't happen, or something that did happen, we can come to the absence of belief that we just don't know that it did in fact happen. And inspired in this account of white privilege, we find a very interesting analysis of social memory, in which it's explained how this white ignorance is inspired in all kind of forms in our environment. And I personally would be that what I would underline as something interesting in all this framework. So social memory determines which historical events and figures are remembered. This memory shapes social identities and subjectivities. And I think it's Mills itself who provides some of the examples of where can we find this social memory, which is everywhere around us. So it's textbooks, ceremonies, official holidays, statues, parks, monuments. Textbooks, statues, like this one of the conquerors of America and Spain, which all the violence that is brings up and how we come to glorify it when we come across these statues, parks. And the interesting turn in this chapter is how this is applied to the case of the internet. And I would like to ask Karen whether this is a move that was already there or is this a new move, because it would be very interesting for me at least to know whether it's a new move to apply this social memory to this case of the internet. And here we have examples like search results, autocomplete suggestions in search engines. This is the case of in the cover of Algorithms of Oppression, a book frequently quoted here. And search results, what happens when we look for professional hairstyles or unprofessional hairstyles, we find two very different patterns and very clear patterns. And here it also gets into more detail in what kind of technological affordances explain some of the cases for the fake news in this social memory. So searchability, like the fact that we can search and even come across contents after they have proved to be debunked, for example. And some of the problems of the profit that drives the suggestions made for each person. Saying, be more specific, that the more that you engage with some content, regardless whether it is true or not, the more your chances you are, or the more the platform is encouraged to present it to you. So, now, to finish, it seems like it is acknowledged during the chapter that there are different motives for the spread of fake news. We had these three different kind of factors for them, but at some point it focuses on the case of white privilege, and racism is identified as probably the major factor behind the spread of fake news, or at least is the one that the chapter is more focused on. And of course, we have some really racist and specifically coming from white privilege, racist fake news, or at least conspiracy theories like this conspiracy theory about the Great Replacement. Or this other example from Spain, focus on racism, suggesting that underage minors with no parents in the country can receive up to 10 times the pension that your grandmother receives. So these are cases of racist fake news, and we have plenty of them. But this opens a question for me, and I guess also for Glenn, and it's what he's going to develop now, which is, why is racism the main factor for fake news, and why not any of the other axes of power that we can find in society? And I would like to ask specifically whether this is an empirical claim that supports that most fake news are driven by racism. And if it is the case, which could perfectly be, then it could be very interesting to find a more detailed explanation of what are the mechanisms of power of racism that explain better why it's racism and not any other form of domination that leads the problem of fake news. And just to finish specifically, if we consider cases other than outside the West, the US or the European Union, why focus so much on the case of the specific case of white ignorance? And well, this is just an example of some of the different forms of identity and power that have been mentioned, and why would be exactly racism the main one to focus on. And just to develop this, it will be Glenn now that takes the word. And thank you very much for a chapter and for listening.
Yeah, so I would like to thank you all as well, especially Karen for the chapter. Which okay, and now I'll get to the kind of the worries we had. So the first one, and the one we'll talk about the most, is the idea that the focus on white ignorance is too US centric. I think this is acknowledged at some point in the chapter, but I think it's still maybe worth talking about why this might be an issue. So we are in complete agreement that, you know, fake news is not neutral, and with the rejection of kind of neutral objectivity, and definitely with, you know, taking into account questions of social justice, for instance, to properly understand and tackle the fake news problem. We were a little bit uncertain whether, you know, this always has to be like racism at the center, or other social justice concerns could also be more important. But I will leave that aside for now. So even if we go with the racist framework, we kind of agree that white ignorance seems like the right framework through which to analyze fake news in a US context. And we also are quite confident on, you know, applying this to the Western world, about that in general. But there is maybe a concern that in general, the discussion of fake news in philosophy and in academia in general is very much focused on the US and on the Western world. And there's not really a good reason to do so. I mean, there are many reasons, there may be a lot of practical reasons, but there's not really a good justification for doing this. And so fake news is, you know, really a global phenomenon, right? Which I think is acknowledged. And so when philosophers, and I think this is really generally speaking, are trying to find definitions of fake news or talk about it, they make a very strong claim about, you know, this being universally applicable. And I think this is also true about, you know, the definitions cited. I'm pretty sure, at least with Dr. Kelford, who I know that this is definitely his goal, and I think it's true about most definitions. And nevertheless, there seems to be a clear bias, right, towards using US examples, using Western examples of fake news. I know, for instance, with Axel, and I know, like in the German-speaking countries, there's a lot of philosophical writing on fake news, and I feel like it's well represented, but there is, there's this really clear bias, and that could lead to a concern that we are kind of, that we are maybe not fully grasping what fake news is and how we understand it. And there might be really just like a practical reason for that most researchers writing in fake news, most philosophers are based in the US or in the Western world, so they just know more about these societies. And it's definitely also much easier to find empirical data on especially US based research, right? That is, it makes it much, much easier in a practical sense. Now, the worry that we have is that the solution proposed here, focusing exclusively on white ignorance to understand fake news, is a little bit too blunt to really capture a lot of the fake news outside of the Western world. It seems fine for what is described in the chapter, but maybe this still makes the whole discussion too US or Western centric. And we think like the negative impact of fake news in what we could call the global south. I'm never really sure about the term global south and whether I like it or not, but I included it here just in quotes because I also didn't want to just say outside of the Western world, right, which seems even worse. But I think that the negative impact of fake news in these societies is real, and arguably it is an even bigger cause of concern than fake news in the US context, even if it's less spoken about. Examples we were thinking about here, and I think there are really numerous examples, much more than we can list, are how fake news is used to foster ethnic tensions in India, or for instance, something that's happening right now, the elections in Kenya, right, where there's worries about the democratic process being undermined by fake news, which is spread there on social media. And the example we'll really focus on a lot to drive this point home is fake news in India. So in India, there is a big problem with disinformation, and also, like memes, for instance, spread online, which often lead to, to ethnic tensions and to the murder of ethnic minorities, and particularly Muslims are, disproportionately affected by this. They're not exclusively targeted, but they're really affected, in a much more heavy sense. And so this is also something that is, to a large extent perpetrated by supporters of the government and the current president. So there's maybe even like a state-sanctioned kind of like a form of fake news taking place here, which raises massive concerns. And so we think that this example is kind of a good way to show our worry about maybe the analysis in this chapter being too US-centric. And the reason being that if you look at this example, clearly it deserves to be covered under the label of fake news. I think any analysis of fake news or definition of it would want to capture this phenomenon. The harm, for me personally, I think I would argue that it is more significant than the harm caused by fake news in the US. If this is too strong of a claim, and it's also an empirical claim, I think at the very least we can say it's equal to the claim of fake news in the US and in the Western world. Okay, so should I move a bit? Okay. And the final point is that we really picked this example also because we can go along with the claim that like racism is kind of underlying most of fake news. This is not like clashing with that claim. But to really understand what's happening in India, I think white ignorance is not the best framework to understand it. White ignorance might have an explanatory role given like the colonial history of India. It's not, a completely useless concept, and it is a global phenomenon, as you say. But I think even though fake news and white ignorance are global phenomena, it doesn't seem plausible that they would completely overlap everywhere in the world. And in this example, I feel like there might be we might need to have a different framework than white ignorance to really understand what's going on. So the proposed solution is just that white ignorance becomes one of the many frameworks we can use, and there's no prioritization to it. If it is prioritized, it should be maybe made clear that this is for analysis of fake news in the US and maybe the Western world as a whole. And I think it, to a certain extent, this is acknowledged in this chapter, right? And it's just that, well, look, this analysis of fake news is US-centric, but given maybe the spirit in which this book was written, right, where there's really a big goal to focus on marginalized communities and put them at the center of this research, maybe that's like still the wrong approach, right? It might lend itself to something else. In general, and I have to say this about, not like to Karen specifically, but about the field in general. So I think in academia, there should be much more research on fake news, maybe in the global south, definitely outside of the US. And philosophers in particular, I think, should be working on developing conceptual frameworks that allow us to address fake news, which are tailored specifically also to societies outside the Western world. And I think that's something that, I personally, as someone who works in fake news, I'm also guilty of, right? If I look at my definition of fake news, it's very much has in mind examples in the Western world. So I wouldn't accept myself from this criticism. I don't think there's a lot happening here at the very least, given how much is written on fake news in philosophy. And we felt like, the spirit of this project, it might be worth at least advocating for centering the discourse on fake news around societies in the global south, right? And this might also be really diverse because we're talking about a huge amount of countries. I could imagine maybe in South Africa that a focus on white ignorance is also quite helpful. I'm probably the least qualified person in this room to make this judgment, but I'm sure there are a lot of people who could comment on that. But as in the case of India, for instance, and I think in a lot of other cases, we'll find that it's not the best framework. And so we felt like this might be something we could focus on. That was the main point we had. We'll have like a second more, which I'll go through a little bit faster. It's again about veritism, which I already commented on a lot, so I'm sorry for some of the repetition. So here the question is just, is veritism really best equipped to capture the harms of fake news? Obviously, I think it does a really good job if you think about the harm fake news causes by inducing false beliefs, right, or things that are not true. Well, what I found interesting about this analysis is that in most definitions of fake news in the philosophical literature, including the one by Gelford, which is quoted here, lacking truth or inducing false beliefs are not necessary conditions of fake news, right? So this does not seem to be what's at the heart of the phenomenon in these understandings of fake news, even the one that is like quoted in this chapter. But one thing which is brought up in almost every definition of fake news is that while it might not lack truth, which is kind of more debated, it always lacks something like truthfulness. And so we were wondering if it might be interesting in thinking about the distinction between truth and truthfulness. This book by Bernard Williams is not that important for it. I just put it there for the title, so you can kind of ignore it. I mean, I'm sure it's great, but it's not really essential. But we were thinking about like specifically this distinction, right? Especially in cases where telling the truth and being truthful come apart, right? So, which might be the case in fake news examples. And here we're also thinking about cases, right, where I say something which is true, but I'm not being truthful. Or, I'm trying to be as truthful as possible and making a true claim, but by really bad luck, let's say maybe epistemic luck, I end up saying something that turns out not to be true. And so in examples like this, what we were thinking about is that the lack of truthfulness might actually be better to explain, or at least also necessary to explain the erosion of epistemic trust that can be caused by fake news. And we could at least imagine some scenarios where it is worse not to be truthful than not telling the truth, right? So if you imagine a fake news example where someone, is spreading something they believe to be wrong, they're clearly trying to be misleading about a claim, and then just by pure dumb luck, it turns out to be true, right? So in a really consequentialist, spiritistic sense, we might say no harm done, right? This is fine. But then we could also imagine like a journalist who does really their due diligence, amazing research, and then by really bad luck, maybe the best scientific evidence we have to date turns out to be false much later or outdated at some point. And what was published was not true. This person might still retain much more epistemic trust that someone who was trying to mislead us and then just through luck or circumstances failed to do so. And so what I also wanted to point to is just there is a definition in the literature that might be helpful for you to integrate, which is one by Joster and Lanius. It's in a book called The Social Epistemology of Fake News by Sven Bernecker and Amy Flowery and someone else that I'm forgetting the name right now. But so it's this larger collection of essays on fake news, and they offer a definition there which claims that fake news lacks both truth and truthfulness as like a necessary condition of fake news. And maybe this might be quite helpful to you or conducive if you want to bring or mention this worry or address this worry. That was the second worry. We had some other worries that we didn't develop, but we thought we would just throw them out.
Cool.
And you can do with them whatever you want. We will not develop them in a lot of detail. So the first is whether the empirical research on asymmetrical polarization is really settled. Because there is, of course, like research that supports this claim, but the way it's presented in the chapter is like that this is completely uncontroversial. And actually, I think we both had the impression that we read quite a lot of research putting this in doubt, right? I think in the US, like researchers like Yushchinsky, who do a lot of work, are much more skeptical about whether there's this like asymmetrical polarization or more ideological lines. I think in philosophy, Neil Levy says something like this in like his new book. So I think there are a lot of people who are doubtful about whether this is settled. So if it is settled, right, if you just take this as a premise, I don't think there's anything wrong with what you argue for in the chapter, but maybe it's a slightly misleading depiction of the state of the research. And then speaking of empirical research, I think we're both like we're happy with the integration of empirical data and empirical research, and we find it very important. But we wonder how well a lot of this data holds up given the fast-changing nature of the internet. And I'm thinking of like criticisms of Google at one point in the chapter, which seemed very plausible, but then the sources are from 2017 or 2011. And I'm really not sure to what extent this is still up to date, right? Because these things happen and change so fast. It's not the strongest criticism because I understand this is just the data that's out there and it's hard to do, but we have to wonder to what extent we can rely on the data, even though it's necessary to take it into account. And the last point is also just a very small point is, in this like debate on sophisticated bad faith Nazis, we actually also both felt that this might not be just a theoretical concern, and there actually are really elaborate cases of organized trolling on platforms such as 4chan that anticipate several responses, kind of mainstream audiences might have to their attempts at trolling and how best to ease them into their worldview and make it palatable to more mainstream people. So I think maybe this is actually quite a real life concern and not just in a completely isolated instance either. So those were our worries, and thanks a lot for listening. Try to include as many languages.
Well done.
That's great. Shall I start us off? Yeah. I want to say completely yes to two of the criticisms, and then one, I think there's maybe a misreading of the chapter, which is probably due to me not explaining it well. Completely yes on the US-centric focus. I completely agree and accept that as a criticism, and something that, I really appreciate being held accountable to. And I just think I should have done better, and plan to do better going ahead. I think there are so many important examples that you brought up. That is just a major fail. And I would say for me, it's a failing of the whole book, not just this chapter. I completely agree with that. And I really like the idea of using truthfulness. I think that would be really helpful. I can see your point really well about how the veritism is maybe not matching well the definitions, and that seems really helpful. So that seems also really useful for me to think about. The one correction is that I don't say in the chapter that racism is the primary driver or even a main one. So just to kind of situate what I was trying to do in the chapter, it's a pushback on a lot of the literature on fake news that doesn't even talk about any kind of power issues or any kind of issues of social situatedness, right? So what I was trying to do in the chapter was to kind of do what Mills does in the white ignorance paper, right? He explicitly says, this is not the only form of socially constructed ignorance, but I'm going to make an intervention along one form and then say, please all go out and talk about male ignorance or cisgender ignorance or whatever, and go write those papers. So, there's a part in the chapter where I say that I'm trying to do the same thing. So the goal was to say, okay, try and do a survey, and you're totally right that by the time it gets published, it's going to be completely outdated, but, survey of the literature on fake news, and then say, okay, but I really want us going ahead, philosophers, to really be thinking about some of these issues of power. And I'm going to demonstrate how we might do it by taking a really well-established tool to think about power in this one case. And also thinking, I thought for Mills, these issues of like memory and our testimonial practices might be, like if somebody demonstrated how these might operate in different ways online, it might spur other people to write stuff like, oh, okay, memory, how is cisgender privilege shaping social memory, or those kinds of things. So it was sort of supposed to be sort of like proof of concept, rather than this is a main cause. So yeah, there wasn't any claim that this is useful for other contexts or even a main cause, but just like, here's a tool, here's how it can be useful. And I think you also asked a question, are there other people writing about, Daniel, about like memory? So there are cool internet studies people who write about social memory. There's like memory studies is a thing. I haven't had a chance to read a lot of it. So the intervention that I was doing in the chapter, which I think is new to me, is applying like Mill's account of collective memory to the internet. I haven't seen anybody else do that. And then there are also, but like Sophia Noble talks about Mills's other work in the racial contract, and Jesse Daniels was way early writing about racism online, using some of Mills's other work. So, but yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. Do we have comments first from the students? Oh, we've got Aisha has a hand up. Aisha, I was going to invite you anyway because I see that you put in a very interesting link. So go for it.
Yes. Hi everyone. I just wanted to quickly comment on this expansion of context beyond the US. So the link that I posted is from a blog talking about the Facebook papers, which came out end of last year. And there is a really good illustration of the lack of structural frameworks within these companies to even address anything like hate speech, but then also misinformation within other contexts than, for example, the US. So there's a really good kind of empirical illustration of the lack of attention in the companies that are actively doing the content moderation.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say that's super useful and really important. Yeah, thanks.
What about the comments for? There's someone else online. Oh, this is here. I wanted to say welcome to Boaz. It's good to have you back with us. David?
This isn't really so much a question. I think maybe some other participants here might be able to help me out. But I was trying to think of fake instances of fake news in South Africa in particular, or at least things that might be fake news adjacent. And I can only really think of two sort of examples, and where I think, I'll give you the examples in a moment, but I think where they might be most closely adjacent to fake news is in terms of their lack of political independence. And insofar, and I think that is, I missed the definition that Daniel gave of fake news earlier, but it does seem like, paradigmatic US cases of fake news. There really is a strong political capture of what's happening in the news source. And these two examples that I was thinking of was first, usually around election time, the ruling party in South Africa generally, or not even the ruling party, but the bigger political parties tend to vie for, and usually are successful in getting more broadcasting airtime. And we've got a lot of political parties in South Africa, and usually the justification for that is that, well, because these bigger parties have more democratic support, they should get more airtime. But I mean, how do we split up, say, an hour of broadcasting time among 20 different political parties? That obviously isn't going to work at all. And another thing, which is probably less prominent, but there's more like on YouTube, you get some independent content, South African content creators who claim that they fly out to China, to the areas of where the Uyghur population is, and say, well, look, guys, there's this news about this, oppression of the Uyghur population, but I don't see this. I don't think it's a unique thing to South Africa. But in that case, and even I'm also thinking about. This is not necessarily from news sources, but from politicians being mum on making any claims about, say, for example, the Ukrainian-Russian war, because there are strong ties politically and economically between South Africa and, say, Russia and China. And I think that they're very different from, again, paradigmatically, US cases of fake news, but which I don't know if it would be useful to incorporate those kinds of examples, but yeah, I don't know if other people have more South African examples.
Kate has a finger. I don't know about an African finger.
I don't know if I have an African finger. Kate, do you have an African finger? African examples? I feel like you were going to raise
No, it's different points.
different points.
I can mention, there's a great paper that I'd be happy to, I am no expert, but I was reading a paper about fake news in South Africa, and some of the examples it mentioned is lots of examples of xenophobic attacks on both sides, saying that this attack happened or this happened due to xenophobia. Often those end up being fake news stories. And then also, you would all know the term better than I would, but around the presidential election, or sorry, the political, the white monopoly capital conspiracy theory. Do folks know about this?
Yeah.
Right. So so there was sort of like political attacks, and there was attempt to say this is part of like a conspiracy on the part of white elites to undermine political leaders. So I could be happy to send anybody that, but you all would be experts on those. But there are like people working on like fake news. That have really cool examples.
I mean, fake news is not pervasive in that way, right? Like if you're not on social media, like I'm not on social media, so I don't see any of it.
Okay.
Right. But anyway, so speaking to David's point, which I thought was really relevant, was maybe you might want, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at like cases of fake news in Russia, because Russia's basically built on lots and lots of fake news, and the point of it is to just to destabilize and to cause disruption, and what that does is it causes like mass sort of distrust in what's going on, and when you have like a mass distrust on that level, you just lose control completely over the situation. You lose control over like what's real and what's not real. I think that also impacts like how much you're able to communicate on the internet, because your social memory and your social fabric is also so affected by this like mass distrust. So I think that could be like a really interesting case if you're looking for something like that.
So I want to say something, but it's going to sound like an excuse, but it's not. It's really just like a reason why maybe I think this work should be done in collaboration. I immediately felt in that example, like I don't have the language skills, and also because it's such a mass, I wouldn't know, I wouldn't trust myself in being able to parse truth from fiction there, right? So I think maybe this call for making sure that we do things in a global context would be a reason why as a discipline we should be co-authoring stuff more, right? Because I feel like I have a good grasp in figuring out what are good examples of fake news in the US context. When it comes to other, I'm often just completely at sea. But I think that would be a perfect example. I just know that I don't think I could do that responsibly.
I think that's totally fair.
So I think that's an interesting methodological question about our field, is that we tend not to do that as well.
Yeah, I really like that point. Thanks, Karen.
You guys are beginning to sound like feminist studies people. I had a comment, like maybe one possible line of defense. Oh, was Abe, did you have a hand or a finger or something?
I have.
Okay, go
Not
for
yet.
Oh, sorry.
I thought we were speaking to.
No, no, it's okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Glenn and Daniel for the presentation. So I'm thinking of your initial comment and something they pressed on heavily, the stuff on white ignorance. And you did say you just used it as, in a sense, the same kind of way that Mill.
Mills.
Mills.
What's his first name?
Charles.
Charles
Yeah.
Mill. I'm thinking Stuart Mills.
Yes. It's a long day.
Now, the way that it's what Charles Mill uses it, right, just as a starting point to say this could be an explanation for most of these other things that happen. And I don't know if within this context, if ignorance would do the job as much as say power would do, especially thinking of it in the global context. So think of and again, also drawing the point of truthfulness now rather than just true stories. So think of in most, well, I'll use the Nigerian context, for example, what's dominant would be spreading of propaganda by the political elites, not necessarily, I mean, they're not all like lies per se, but it's just like using the truth in very fancy ways to pass on dubious information. So in those sorts of cases, I don't really think it's so much about ignorance as it is about the power that they have. And I think thinking of it in terms of power might cover a much larger group, so to speak. Because even in the American case, the white ignorance in those sorts of settings are also tied to the power asymmetry within those societies. Yeah, just thinking of that.
That's a really nice point. It makes me think of what Mills says about motivational group interests, right? And how one of the sort of causes of, this is me wanting to go back to ignorance, so maybe I'm not actually answering your question now, right? But is that like white people have a group interest in maintaining their spot in the racial hierarchy. And so they have a motivation to promote that kind of ignorance. And maybe it's helpful to think about other groups trying to wield the spreading of misinformation or, like you suggested, like playing with truths, right, to maintain their power or to gain power. Yeah, that would be really useful. Did you? Yeah. It looked like you had a further thought on that, like I didn't.
Yeah. While you were speaking, I just thought, maybe it's also ignorance too. So maybe it's a mixture of both. Because for the powerful, the political elites, they also benefit from the citizens being ignorant of the reality of things. So yeah, I think.
Yeah. I think that sounds right.
Yeah, I think of fake news as a project to disseminate ignorance, to really make people ignorant of the alternative, which is the truth. And I think it's very alive in political setting, where those with power, perpetuate a particular narrative in order to misinform, miseducate, blind people. It's a project of obscuring something, and I think that obscuring is very dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering whether I couldn't. I thought you were being a little different about the criticism that it's all too U.S. dominated.
Oh, really?
And in particular, the quick link between white ignorance and therefore it's U.S. dominated.
Oh, I wasn't necessarily.
Okay, so not
Yes,
about that one,
please.
but I think that one
Yeah.
is wrong, right? Because we very much have
Yes.
it here all the time. So, but the more general point about the U.S. dominance. And I was wondering whether one couldn't link up to your talk 2 days ago, in which you were saying that precisely part of the problem with online spaces is how dominated they are, colonized, as you said, by the US and the West more generally. So one could just say, well, yeah, the reason why we're focusing on fake news in this way is because the global north is dominating these spaces. So if you want to fix things fundamentally, you want to kind of eradicate the problems at the global north dominant level first.
Mhm.
So I was wondering whether
I like
there's any
that.
bread in that.
I guess I would say I wasn't taking that, so the spirit of the objection was like, why not use less, so non-US centric examples of like the harms of fake news or examples of them? And I would maybe say like, let's put both of those together, right? So the talk I gave on Wednesday would be like, we could understand how there's violence in India. In part, we'd have to talk about what's going on with the colonialism of Silicon Valley making moderation decisions about content in India, right? So that I think there's a way of saying like, yes, there should be more non-US based examples, but you're certainly right that you end up having to go back and talk about the colonialism of the US corporations and policies. Yeah. But I do think it's not good to just have US examples.
No, yeah, that's
Yeah.
a good point. Oh, that's someone online. Aisha.
Yes, I do have another point actually. Coming back to the question of misinformation, I just remembered reading a paper once during my master's degree. I'm going to post a Washington Post article about it, but there's also a research article related to the same findings. And it was about misinformation and the role that Twitter users play and citizens play within blocking misinformation as well as propagating misinformation. And I thought it was at that time really interesting to see that it counters this narrative that there are kind of these troll farms, but there are also a lot of citizens actively engaged in either countering or spreading it, and that this kind of agency is often neglected. So that might be something. I don't know whether you have it in the chapter already, but that might be something to look into as well.
Yeah, that's really cool. So there's some, Whitney Phillips has been writing a bunch of stuff about this kind of issue of the individual responsibility that we all need to take for sharing fake news. And some of her examples are particularly like, say for example, like in the US, again, a US example, but the liberals bear for spreading fake news because they were sharing it so that they could laugh at conservatives. Like, look how stupid these Trump voters are. They believe Pizzagate. They believe these ridiculous things, right? And so sharing things, even to point out that they're wrong or to laugh at them, right, can be a kind of propagating of fake news that individual citizens can play a role in. And there's two people, Joan Donovan and Dana Boyd, have really cool stuff where they develop this notion of strategic silencing. They're particularly interested in journalists, like when should journalists just not cover a fake news story, right? Because I talk a bit in the chapter about this sort of like cycle of fake news story comes out, then journalists have to debunk it, but then more people get access to the story, right? And so this sort of like you're saying, like spreading. So to take your point about Twitter users, like we also do that when we're like, oh, let's debunk this fake news story, or let's show everybody this isn't really true, but we're just like keeping it alive, right? So I think you're right that there's a lot that we could be talking about as individual users to what we could be doing to combat fake news. Yeah, I'd love to read that link that you just shared. Oh, cool, okay.
Glenn.
No, I wanted to address actually the point you made before, Valerie, because I really agree, right, that there's this really structural unfairness that, yes, of course, like I mean, all the big tech companies that kind of enable this, they are based in, let's say, the global north, and so it's fair to criticize that. But I think that, to me, seems like it would have to happen in the chapter on moderation rather than the chapter on fake news, right? Because like the way I read this chapter was that the argument about right ignorance is directly about the fake news itself. And there, I feel like it's not so helpful to just point at kind of the technology that makes that possible, right? So that's, I think, why we also focused on this comment here. I would have not made this comment, for instance, in the moderation chapter.
They're not really separate issues, which is actually part of the problem in breaking them up into separate chapters.
Yeah, that must have been a nightmare, actually, exactly which one goes where. Any other comments for Len and Daniel or for Karen? Somebody in the chat? No. Cool, thank you very much, and especially Daniel, whose second presentation this was. So we're going to break for half an hour and have a coffee, and then come back online at 4:30 our time. Already.
I never know where to look in this room.
No,
You know,
this is-
it's making me feel really weird. I'm like trying to talk to somebody, I don't know where the camera is.